Guys, welcome to this video on partial pressures and altitude. In this video we're going to think a little bit about what happens to our respiratory system when we start to exercise at altitude. We're going to think a little bit about the theory behind it and then talk about what actually happens both in terms of responses of the respiratory system and also any adaptations that we can create and we can hope for if we train regularly at altitude. So you'll remember from previous videos that partial pressure is a way of describing the contribution to the overall pressure in a mixture of gases. So let's say we have in the air, for example, we have a mixture of gases, and each of those gases contributes a proportion of the overall pressure. And that proportion of the overall pressure, let's say of oxygen within air, so oxygen makes up about 20% of the air, therefore it makes up about 20% of the pressure of the air. So that's what we mean when we say partial pressures. And you can go back and watch the previous video on partial pressures to get more information about that. But I'm going to assume that we understand that for now and we're going to move on from that point. So you'll recall, hopefully having watched previous videos, that each gas exchange surface in the respiratory system, by which we mean wherever the capillaries are, so around the alveoli and around the muscle cells in our case, at each gas exchange surface, the partial pressures, that's the proportion of the combination of gases, those partial pressures change. And we're particularly interested in oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you'll remember at the alveoli, where the pulmonary capillaries surround the alveoli, the pressures change because we're transferring oxygen into the capillaries and transferring carbon dioxide out. So therefore, at those gas exchange surfaces, the partial pressures, the proportion of oxygen and carbon dioxide is changing. The alveoli, it goes one way, and then at the muscle cells it goes in the opposite direction. So as I said, this happens at the alveoli and at the muscle cells. Basically, it happens wherever there are capillaries, because that's the point of capillaries. The capillaries are there in order to allow gas exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen at various of the body cells and the body structures. But what's really important to note is that whatever the diffusion gradient is, so let's just clarify what I mean by that before I move on. The diffusion gradient is the difference between the partial pressure of a gas on one side of a membrane versus the partial pressure of that same gas on the other side of a membrane. So what the partial pressure is of oxygen within the alveoli, if it's much greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, we have a very large diffusion gradient. And the bigger the diffusion gradient, the diffusion slope, you could think of it in terms of a slope, that the steeper the slope, the faster the oxygen will run from where there's a high proportion, a high concentration of oxygen, to where there's a low concentration of oxygen. And that is why we talked about in the previous video on partial pressures. That is why oxygen can move in one direction across a membrane at the same time as carbon dioxide moving in the opposite direction. They simply move from where there's a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So the bigger that gap is between high and low, the faster that will happen. Now, this video is all about what happens to that diffusion gradient, the difference between the high proportion and the low proportion of oxygen and carbon dioxide, when we move to altitude, when we move beyond sea level, we go up a mountain or up a hill. What happens to the gradient, the difference between the concentration of oxygen in the air and in the alveoli eventually versus the concentration of oxygen in the bloodstream. And when those things change, the diffusion gradient changes, and so therefore the speed at which oxygen and carbon dioxide can be transferred between those two locations slows down. So altitude has an impact on diffusion gradient. Let's talk this through in a little bit more detail though. So in terms of partial pressures, again, so that's the total proportion of pressure in a mixture of gases, you'll note we've got here that overall air pressure decreases with altitude. So as we move up a hill or up a mountain, overall air pressure decreases with altitude. That just means that the gases that make up a fixed volume of air, it doesn't matter what the volume is too much, but let's say we took a cubic meter of air down at sea level and we investigated what gas particles were in that cubic meter of air down at sea level, we would find the same percentages. We would find it's 20% oxygen or 21% oxygen. We'd find it's 0.04% carbon dioxide down at sea level. And then if we went up and took a cubic meter of air from 5,000 meters up above sea level, we would find less gas in that cubic meter of air, but the proportions would be the same. The partial pressure would be the same. It would still be 21% oxygen. There'd just be less oxygen, less actual numbers of oxygen molecules. Same with carbon dioxide. We go up to that 5,000 meters, and in our cubic meter of air that we take from 5,000 meters in that same exact volume, we would find percentage-wise still the same percentage of the air that's there is carbon dioxide. It's just there's less of it. And that's really important to note, that the partial pressures don't change at altitude, but the volume, but the proportion of air in the overall volume is less. So the partial pressures don't change as percentages, but the actual pressures do change because there's less of a particular gas, or less of all the gases, when we move up to altitude. Let me show you some numbers. So at sea level, overall air pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. 760 millimeters of mercury, and that accounts for the whole overall air pressure. And so in terms of partial pressure, that's obviously 100%. That's all the air, all the molecules, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the carbon dioxide, the inert gases like argon and so on, all that are in a mixture in the air. At sea level, altogether, their combined pressures come to 760 millimeters of mercury. But then, because oxygen makes up 21% of that overall pressure, because 21% of the molecules are oxygen molecules, therefore 21% of the overall pressure is the partial pressure of oxygen. And so in this case, because 21% of 760 is 160, therefore we say that at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. That's just 21% of 760. And we can do the same with carbon dioxide. So in terms of carbon dioxide at sea level, roughly 0.04% of the overall pressure is carbon dioxide. Therefore, working that through, about approximately, and it varies a little bit, but approximately 0.3 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at sea level. Now let's move up a little bit and see how these figures change. So let's go up to 5,000 feet. Now you remember I said that pressure is a measure of the number of molecules within a fixed volume. Okay, so we've gone from sea level to 5,000 feet. We're going to take the same volume of air. But because the particles are much more spread out at 5,000 feet than they are at sea level, in our cubic meter of air, we're going to have fewer overall particles, air particles, whether that's oxygen or carbon dioxide or whatever. And so therefore, the overall pressure when we go up to 5,000 feet of all the gases in the air combined drops down to 632 millimeters of mercury. So that's everything combined. That's everything all in our 1 cubic meter of air. The pressure of that air now is 632 millimeters of mercury. And again, you'll notice that because the proportions stay the same, 21% of that overall volume of air up at 5,000 feet is oxygen. So therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen at 5,000 feet is 21% of 632, which works out as 133 millimeters of mercury. So you can see, going from sea level to 5,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen, even though it's still 21%, the partial pressure of oxygen has dropped from 160 millimeters of mercury down to 133 millimeters of mercury. Likewise, carbon dioxide has dropped a tiny little bit as well. Let's move up to 10,000 feet. Same again, the same concept again. The further we go up, the fewer molecules we'll have in our cubic meter of air. And so therefore the overall total pressure is lower again. So if we go up to 10,000 feet, we'll find that the pressure, the overall air pressure, is 523 millimeters of mercury. 21% of that is oxygen. Therefore 21% of the overall pressure is the partial pressure of oxygen. So at 10,000 feet now, our partial pressure of oxygen has dropped down to 110 millimeters of mercury. So what you can see happening as we go up in terms of altitude is that the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is dropping, it's decreasing. So overall air pressure decreases with altitude. So do all the partial pressures. They also decrease with altitude. So what does this mean? So this is going to impact the diffusion gradients between the air in the alveoli and the air in the venous blood. So that's the blood being returned to the heart and pumped to the lungs. So that blood that's arriving at the lungs to pick up oxygen, the difference between the volume of oxygen in the alveoli and the bloodstream is going to be significantly less, because the proportion or the partial pressure of oxygen of the air that we're breathing in order to transfer that oxygen, that partial pressure is already reduced because we're at 10,000 feet. And so the next consequence of this is, the greater the altitude, the smaller the diffusion gradient between the alveolar air and the venous blood. So you can understand, I hope now, what impact that will have in terms of the speed at which oxygen and carbon dioxide can be swapped between the alveoli and the lungs. The alveoli and the capillaries in the lungs. The greater the altitude, as you can see here, we've gone up from sea level to 10,000 feet, and oxygen's partial pressure has dropped down from 160 millimeters of mercury down all the way to 110 millimeters of mercury. So when we breathe that air in, the difference between that air, once it gets into the alveoli, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the bloodstream is much less than it would be if we were down at sea level. And that has significant consequences in terms of how our respiratory system has to work in order to transfer and transport that oxygen to where it's needed. So let's just again do some more numbers on this to make this as clear as possible. So here we are at sea level again. We've got our partial pressures, we've got our atmospheric pressures. And these are the same numbers we had on the previous slide. So at sea level, let's look at oxygen in terms of its partial pressure. So it's 21% of the overall air pressure, which means it's 160 millimeters of mercury. Once that air is breathed in and it gets into the alveoli, it's approximately, because it mixes with air that's already in the alveoli, the residual volume of that air, it mixes up and gets into the alveoli. So by the time it hits the alveoli, we're looking at air that's contains approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. That is the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is significantly higher than that in the atmospheric air, because it's where it is being breathed out from, if you see what I mean. So it's being transported from the bloodstream into the alveoli, ready to be breathed out. So there's a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot more carbon dioxide, a lot higher proportion or partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli than there is in the atmospheric air, and there's somewhat less oxygen in terms of partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli compared to the atmospheric air. But how does that compare to the oxygen and the carbon dioxide pressures within the venous blood? When we say venous blood, that means the blood in the veins that's being returned to the lungs to pick up or to drop off oxygen, carbon dioxide, respectively. So in the venous blood, the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood is 40 millimeters of mercury. So in the alveolar air, it's 100 millimeters of mercury. That's the partial pressure of oxygen. And in the venous blood at sea level, remember, it's 40 millimeters of mercury. So we have a diffusion gradient, a difference between those two of 60 millimeters of mercury. That's a nice high diffusion gradient, which means it's relatively easy to transfer the oxygen from where it's at a high concentration in the alveoli into the bloodstream, because there's that nice big diffusion gradient of 60 millimeters of mercury. Well, with the carbon dioxide partial pressures in the alveolar air is about 40, and in the venous blood it's slightly higher because that carbon dioxide has been picked up as a consequence of respiration, and now we're at 46 millimeters of mercury in the venous blood. So that gives us a diffusion gradient of 6 millimeters of mercury. So now what happens when we move up in terms of altitude? Let's see how these numbers change. So you'll note what we're particularly interested in here is the diffusion gradient on the right hand side. So we've got a nice, down at sea level, we've got a nice solid diffusion gradient, nice steep diffusion gradient, where the alveolar air contains 100 millimeters of mercury, venous blood 40, so we've got a diffusion gradient of 60. That oxygen is going to flow into the venous blood, and likewise the other way around, we've got a diffusion gradient difference heading in the opposite direction for carbon dioxide, whereby it's higher in the blood, so it's going to flow from the blood into the alveoli to try and level those numbers up. But then we head up to altitude. Let's go up to 10,000 feet and look at the numbers again. So again, partial pressures in terms of percentages are the same. We've still got 21% is oxygen, 0.04% is carbon dioxide, but that relates to different pressures in real terms. So the overall air pressure up at 10,000 feet is 523 millimeters of mercury. So therefore the oxygen pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen, is 21% of that, 110 millimeters of mercury. So when we breathe that air in, and it mixes with the air that's already in our lungs, we end up with 10,000 feet above sea level, we end up with a mixture of air in our alveoli that is 60 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. So it's significantly lower than the 100 millimeters of mercury that we get into our alveoli at sea level. So what does that mean in terms of the diffusion gradient? Well, think this through. In the venous blood, if we're doing the same level of exercise, we're demanding the same amount of oxygen, and we're producing the same volume of carbon dioxide. So therefore, in terms of the venous blood, the oxygen levels are going to be significantly lower, because we're demanding from that alveolar air, from what we're getting into the bloodstream, we're taking a significant proportion of it out in order to do the work, the exercise, or whatever. So in terms of the venous blood up at 10,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen is lower in the venous blood and also lower in the alveolar air. But you'll notice what's significant here is the difference between those two numbers, because we've said already the difference between those numbers is the diffusion gradient. The steeper the diffusion gradient, the faster the oxygen or the carbon dioxide will travel from one to the other. So in this case, you'll notice the diffusion gradient is only 29 millimeters of mercury, which means it's less than half as steep a gradient as we have at sea level, which means that in terms of the flow of oxygen, we're going to have less than half the speed of flow of oxygen because the diffusion gradient has dropped so much. So we get up to 10,000 feet above sea level, the diffusion gradient comes right down, and so therefore it's harder, or the body has to work harder to get sufficient oxygen in because it's not flowing in as fast due to the low diffusion gradient. The same is true of the venous blood. However, because we're working in much lower overall real terms numbers of carbon dioxide molecules, the difference in the diffusion gradient is much less noticeable. So the diffusion gradient, it does change a little, but it's so insignificant because we're dealing with carbon dioxide, which is 0.04% anyways. It's only a tiny fragment of what we're talking about in terms of the overall pressures. The diffusion gradient doesn't really take a hit when it comes to carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is being breathed out essentially at the same, or being diffused out into the alveolar air essentially at the same rate, but oxygen is coming in much more slowly. And so the key difference that we need to be aware of at altitude is the massive drop in diffusion gradient for oxygen. Because the partial pressures overall as a percentage don't change, but the real terms pressures do change, and they change most significantly for oxygen. So that diffusion gradient dropping as we go higher and higher. So to summarize that, here's a picture or a graph and a picture on a graph. Here's Mount Everest, 29,000 feet. Very simply, high altitude means a low diffusion gradient. Okay, so the higher we go, the lower the diffusion gradient is. And specifically, we're talking about oxygen, aren't we? Because that's what we need to get in order to respire and produce energy. So the higher we go in terms of altitude, the lower the diffusion gradient, the harder it is to get that oxygen in and supplied to the working muscles. And then conversely, the lower the altitude, the higher the diffusion gradient. So if we're down at sea level or near to sea level, the diffusion gradient is sufficient for us to be able to transfer that oxygen into the bloodstream and get it to the working muscles. So, what are the responses that the body makes to counteract this issue? So we've explained that if we go up a mountain, then it's going to be harder to get the oxygen because of the diffusion gradient, harder to get the oxygen in and supplied to the working muscles. What impact does that have? Well, the responses to low diffusion gradients, so again, high altitude means low gradients. Responses to low diffusion gradients include some of these things. Number one, less oxygen combining with hemoglobin. Well, that's obvious, isn't it? We're getting less oxygen into the bloodstream, so less oxygen is combining with hemoglobin. In order to compensate for sending less oxygen around the body increases the respiration rate, the breathing rate. So in order to compensate for having less oxygen coming in because of that low diffusion gradient, we simply breathe more quickly in order to try and compensate that. Also, we try and compensate by increasing the heart rate. So the body regulates both the respiration rate and the heart rate according to the proportions of gases in the blood. So therefore, when it spots or realizes that the oxygen levels are too low, it responds by increasing the respiratory rate. So we breathe more often per minute, and also increases the heart rate. So the heart beats more often per minute. The whole system just moves faster. One of the problems, however, is that that could potentially cause something that's known as altitude sickness. Altitude sickness. And that has these impacts. It might cause dizziness. It might cause headache. And it might cause nausea or vomiting. So these are the possible signs that you're experiencing altitude sickness. This is why when people go and live at altitude or train at altitude, ideally they should give themselves sufficient time to allow their bodies to adapt rather than simply respond to moving up higher to higher altitude. The body's responses are the short-term things that it does to cope with the low diffusion gradients, the three things I've mentioned on the screen. But if we do stay at altitude for a period of time, our body begins to adapt in order to cope with the change in diffusion gradients. And there are some adaptations that occur that are actually beneficial to sports people. And so what are the adaptations? So adaptations, so these are long-term changes that occur to our physiology, the long-term changes that occur to our anatomy as a consequence of spending time at altitude. First of all, our total blood volume increases. So we actually have a greater volume of blood, which means more hemoglobin. So although we may not be bringing in quite as much oxygen, the oxygen that is available can be harnessed more effectively by increased blood volume and carried around the body. So we can actually get, given we've got greater blood volume, we can actually get more oxygen into the system. We will also experience higher EPO levels. Now, EPO is that hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, erythropoietin. And so if we have higher EPO levels as a consequence of spending some time at altitude, we are going to produce greater numbers of red blood cells, which gives us a higher red blood cell count, which is known as the hematocrit. So higher red blood cell count, overall numbers of red blood cells, means more red blood cells combining or fixing oxygen and carrying that oxygen where it's needed. Another long-term adaptation, an anatomical change, is that those places where transfer of gases, gaseous exchange takes place, in our context specifically the alveoli and the working muscles, they actually develop more capillaries, they grow more capillaries. So we have what's called capillarization of both the alveoli and the muscle. More capillaries, a greater capillary density, greater capillary network means more places where oxygen and carbon dioxide can be transferred. So the whole system is trying to create a way of being more efficient because it's recognized that the availability of oxygen is lower due to those lower partial pressures, that lower diffusion gradient. So the body adapts itself by increasing blood volume, more EPO production, higher red blood cell count, and then the capillarization of those parts of the body, of parts of the anatomy where gaseous exchange takes place, so the alveoli and the muscle. And this is why, and we won't go into in too much detail in this video because we've run on a while here, but this is why some athletes will prepare for aerobic endurance events by training at altitude. Because an aerobic endurance event very much relies upon your ability to supply oxygen. So if you've created these adaptations, higher blood volume, higher EPO levels, higher red blood cell count, capillarization of the alveoli, if you can create those adaptations by training at altitude, then when you come back down and race at sea level, in theory, you will be better prepared and better ready to supply the oxygen needed for your aerobic endurance event. It also works by, if you stay at sea level but use what's called a hypoxic chamber. Hypoxic just means low oxygen, and it just has the exact same effect of training at altitude because it's low oxygen, so the body recognizes it's low oxygen and goes through the same adaptations. So some athletes will deliberately either go and train at altitude or recreate the conditions of altitude in order to get these adaptations so that they can be better then at their aerobic endurance events. Well, that's been quite a long video, but it's a relatively complex idea. I hope I've explained it clearly enough for you. If you've got any further questions, please add them in the comments below and I will definitely get back to you in due course. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video. Take care for now. I'll see you in the next one.